Helena Vasquez works as a dishwasher at Sterling's, an upscale restaurant in Manhattan. When tech billionaire Marcus Wellington dines there and mocks her accent in front of his business associates, he has no idea that Helena is a former linguistics professor who speaks 5 languages fluently. After she quietly corrects his mispronunciation of a French wine in perfect French, Marcus becomes intrigued. As their worlds collide, both discover that true worth isn't measured by wealth or status, but by character, resilience, and the courage to see beyond surface appearances. The steam from the industrial dishwasher created a hazy curtain in the cramped kitchen of Sterling's, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants. Helena Vasquez wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her rubber-gloved hand, her dark hair escaping from the hairnet, despite her best efforts to keep it contained. The dinner rush was in full swing, and plates seemed to multiply faster than she could clean them. "Helena, table 12 needs these glasses now," shouted Miguel, the head waiter, as he burst through the swinging doors with his arms full of dirty dishes. His voice carried the urgency that permeated every corner of Sterling's during peak hours. "Si, Miguel. Right away," Helena replied, her slight accent adding a musical quality to her English. She quickly rinsed the crystal wine glasses, each one worth more than she earned in a day, and dried them with the precision of someone who understood that perfection was not optional in this establishment. The kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos. Chef Harrison barked orders in his thick Brooklyn accent, while sous chefs danced around each other with hot pans and sharp knives. The air was thick with the aroma of truffle oil, seared duck, and the expensive wines that flowed freely in the dining room beyond the kitchen doors. Helena had been working at Sterling's for 8 months now, ever since arriving in New York City, with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of determination. The job wasn't glamorous. Her hands were constantly wrinkled from the hot water, and her back ached from hours of bending over the massive sinks, but it paid enough for her small studio apartment in Queens and allowed her to send a little money back to her mother in Guatemala. "Table 7 is asking for more of those fancy butter rolls," called out Sarah, one of the newer servers, as she grabbed a basket from the warming station. "And the guy at table 12 is being particularly demanding tonight. Keeps sending back his wine, claiming it's not the right temperature." Helena glanced up from the plates she was scrubbing. Through the small window in the kitchen door, she could see into the elegant dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths and fresh orchid centerpieces. Table 12 housed 4 men in expensive suits, their laughter carrying over the gentle murmur of conversation that filled the restaurant. "Who's at table 12? Elder asked Sarah during a brief lull in the dish flow. "Some tech billionaire and his business partners. Marcus Wellington, I think his name is. Miguel says he owns half the startups in Silicon Valley and just bought some big building downtown." Sarah rolled her eyes. "He's been complaining about everything. The temperature, the music volume, even questioned whether our sommelier knew what he was doing." Helena nodded, returning her attention to the endless stream of dishes. She'd learned early in her time at Sterling's that the wealthy patrons often treated the restaurant like their personal kingdom, expecting perfection while showing little respect for the people who made that perfection possible. The evening continued its relentless pace. Helena moved efficiently between the dish pit and the glass station, occasionally helping Miguel carry clean plates to the warming area. Her movements were economical and practiced. 8 months of this work had taught her how to conserve energy while maintaining the speed the kitchen demanded. Around 9:30, as the dinner rush began to wind down, Helena was carrying a tray of clean glasses toward the bar area when she heard loud laughter coming from table 12. One voice rose above the others, rich with condescension and amusement. "I'm telling you, these people come here thinking they can fake it, but you can hear that accent from across the room." "Si, Miguel," she says. The voice continued in an exaggerated, mocking imitation of Elena's earlier words. "Probably doesn't even understand half of what we're saying." Elena froze behind the small service area that separated the kitchen from the dining room, the tray of glasses trembling slightly in her hands. She recognized the voice immediately. It was Marcus Wellington, the tech billionaire Sarah had mentioned. "Come on, Marcus, that's a bit harsh," another voice protested weakly, though it was clear the speaker lacked conviction. "Harsh? I'm being realistic. This is supposed to be a world-class establishment. They shouldn't have people who can barely speak English, working where clients can see them. It's unprofessional." Wellington's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that his words might actually reach their target. Eleanor's cheeks burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She'd experienced prejudice before, But hearing herself dismissed so casually by someone who didn't know her, had never spoken to her, and had formed his opinion based solely on her appearance and accent, felt like a physical blow. She set the tray down carefully, her hands no longer trembling but steady with a different kind of resolve. Through the service window, she could see Wellington clearly now, a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled grey hair and a suit that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. He was gesturing expansively with a glass of wine, completely unaware that the subject of his mockery was within earshot. "The thing is," Wellington continued, warming to his topic, "people like that are fine for behind-the-scenes work, but they shouldn't be visible to customers. It affects the ambiance. When I'm paying $300 for a bottle of Chateau Margaux, I don't want to be reminded of—" He gestured vaguely, leaving his prejudiced thoughts unfinished but perfectly clear. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She glanced around the kitchen, noting that several of her co-workers had paused in their work, having heard Wellington's comments. Miguel's face was dark with anger, while Chef Harrison looked like he was considering marching into the dining room himself. But before anyone else could react, Elena made a decision. She smoothed her apron, checked her reflection in the stainless steel surface of the refrigerator, and walked with quiet dignity toward table 12. The dining room seemed to hush slightly as she approached, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the polished floor. Wellington was mid-sentence explaining some business deal to his companions when Elena appeared beside their table. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I couldn't help but notice you're drinking the Chateau Margaux 2015. Wellington looked up, startled by the interruption. His expression quickly shifted to one of mild annoyance. "Yes, and?" Elena smiled politely, her hands clasped in front of her. "You pronounced it beautifully, but I believe you asked for the Chateau Margaux 2010, which has more of the complexity you were describing to your guests. The 2015, while excellent, is perhaps too young for your refined palate." The table fell silent. Wellington stared at Elena, clearly trying to process this unexpected interaction. "I'm sorry, do you work here?" "I do," Elena replied calmly. "And I noticed you seemed concerned about the wine service earlier. In French we would say, "Ce vin a besoin de plus de temps pour respirer." This wine needs more time to breathe. Perhaps I could ask our sommelier to decant the 2010 for you. It would better complement the duck confit you've ordered." Wellington's mouth opened slightly. The French had rolled off Elena's tongue with perfect Parisian pronunciation, each word crisp and elegant. His business associates exchanged glances, clearly as surprised as their host. "You speak French?" Wellington managed. "Oui, bien sûr," Elena replied with a gentle smile. "Also Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and German. Languages have always been a passion of mine." She turned to one of Wellington's guests, who had been struggling with the Italian wine descriptions on the menu earlier. "Signore, if you'd prefer, I could recommend the Barolo instead of the Chianti. It pairs beautifully with the Osso Bucco and has the full body you were looking for. È un vino molto robusto e complesso." The man's eyes widened. "Your Italian is perfect. Where did you learn?" "University," Elena replied simply. "I spent 2 years in Florence studying linguistic anthropology." Wellington's face had gone through several shades of red during this exchange. The casual arrogance that had characterized his earlier mockery was nowhere to be seen, replaced by something that looked distinctly like embarrassment. Elena turned back to him with the same polite smile she'd maintained throughout the interaction. "Should I ask our sommelier about the 2010 Chateau Margaux, Mr. Wellington? I believe it would be much more to your liking." For a moment, Wellington seemed unable to speak. The other diners at nearby tables had begun to take notice of the unusual scene. A dishwasher conversing fluently in multiple languages with one of Manhattan's most prominent business figures. Yes, Wellington finally managed. "That would be—" "Thank you." Eleanor nodded graciously. "It would be my pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening, gentlemen." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her spine straight and her head high. Behind her, she could hear the uncomfortable silence at table 12, broken only by the quiet murmur of Wellington's guests beginning to speak in hushed, urgent tones. As Eleanor pushed through the kitchen doors, she was met by a round of applause from her co-workers. Miguel grinned broadly and gave her a thumbs up, while Chef Harrison nodded approvingly from his station. "Elena," Miguel said, his voice filled with admiration, "that was incredible. Where did you really learn all those languages?" Elena smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes that her co-workers couldn't quite understand. "It's a long story, Miguel. Maybe someday I'll tell it." She returned to her station at the dish pit, but her hands moved automatically now, her mind elsewhere. The confrontation had felt good in the moment. There was satisfaction in seeing Wellington's shocked expression, in proving that his assumptions about her were not just wrong, but embarrassingly so. But as the adrenaline faded, Elena felt the familiar ache of everything she'd lost, everything that had brought her to this kitchen in the first place. Speaking those languages, discussing wines and literature, had reminded her of the person she used to be, the life she'd left behind. Outside in the dining room, Marcus Wellington sat in uncomfortable silence, absently swirling the wine in his glass. His business associates had resumed their conversation, but their voices carried an edge of awkwardness that hadn't been there before. Wellington found himself glancing repeatedly toward the kitchen doors, as if he could somehow see through them to where Eleanor had returned to her work. In the span of 5 minutes, everything he thought he knew about the young woman with the accent had been completely shattered. He'd built his fortune on being able to read people, on making quick judgments about character and potential. It was a skill that had served him well in the ruthless world of venture capital, but tonight, that same instinct had led him to make an assumption so wrong, so publicly humiliating, that he could feel his cheeks burning with shame. The sommelier appeared at his table with the 2010 Chateau Margaux, and Wellington tasted it with the appreciation of someone who truly understood wine. Eleanor had been absolutely right. This vintage was far superior to what he'd been drinking, with exactly the complexity and depth he preferred. As the evening wound down and his guests prepared to leave, Wellington found himself lingering at the table, his eyes still drawn to the kitchen doors. He'd spent years surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his opinions. Tonight, a dishwasher, a woman he'd dismissed and mocked, had shown him more grace and intelligence than he'd encountered in most boardrooms. And Marcus Wellington realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that he had absolutely no idea what to do with that knowledge. 3 days had passed since the incident at Sterling's, but Marcus Wellington couldn't stop thinking about Elena Vasquez. He sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Wellington Tower, staring out at the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. The quarterly report spread across his mahogany desk remained untouched, despite his assistant's gentle reminders about the afternoon board meeting. "Mr. Wellington?" Jennifer, his longtime assistant, peered around the door. "The Yamamoto Group is holding online too. They're expecting your decision on the Tokyo expansion." Marcus turned away from the window, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Tell them I'll call back within the hour. I need some air." Jennifer raised an eyebrow. In 15 years of working for Marcus Wellington, she'd never known him to postpone an important business call for something as simple as needing air, but she nodded professionally. "Of course, sir. Should I reschedule your lunch with Senator Morrison as well?" "No, keep that. I'll be back in time." Marcus grabbed his jacket from the leather chair. "Actually, Jennifer, do we have any information on Sterling's restaurant? Ownership structure, financial records, that sort of thing?" "The restaurant, I can pull their public filings if you're considering an investment. Are you thinking of expanding into hospitality?" Marcus paused at the doorway. "Something like that. Have the reports ready when I get back." 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself standing across the street from Sterling's, feeling oddly nervous. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin out, and through the large windows he could see the elegant dining room, where his assumptions had been so thoroughly dismantled 3 nights earlier. He'd built his empire on decisive action, on moving forward without second-guessing himself, but something about Elena Vasquez had left him uncharacteristically uncertain. He'd replayed their brief interaction countless times, analyzing not just what she'd said, but how she'd carried herself, with a dignity that remained intact, despite his earlier cruelty. The bell above the door chimed softly as Marcus entered Sterling's. The afternoon light streaming through the windows gave the restaurant a different atmosphere than the intimate evening ambiance he remembered. Sarah, the server from the other night, approached with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wellington. Will you be dining alone today?" Marcus was surprised she remembered his name, though he supposed his embarrassing encounter had made him memorable for all the wrong reasons. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with someone from your kitchen staff. The young woman who helped with the wine selection the other night. Elena, I believe." Sarah's expression shifted, becoming slightly protective. "Elena. She's working the lunch shift today. May I ask what this is about? I'd like to apologize for my behavior the other evening, and perhaps thank her for her recommendation. The wine was exceptional." After a moment of consideration, Sarah nodded toward the bar. "Have a seat. I'll see if she's available." Marcus chose a stool at the far end of the bar, away from the few remaining lunch patrons. The afternoon bartender, a young man with careful hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of cocktails, politely offered a drink, but Marcus declined, his attention focused on the kitchen doors. When Elena emerged, she'd traded her kitchen attire for street clothes, dark jeans and a simple blue blouse that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and without the harsh kitchen lighting, Marcus could see she was probably in her early 30s, with fine lines around her eyes that suggested both intelligence and worry. "Mr. Wellington," she said, approaching with the same calm composure she'd shown during their previous encounter. "Sarah said you wanted to speak with me." Marcus stood, suddenly feeling the awkwardness of the situation. "Please, call me Marcus. And yes, I wanted to apologize for what you overheard the other night. My comments were inexcusable." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his contrition was genuine. "Thank you for the apology. It takes character to admit when you're wrong." "Character," Marcus repeated, the word carrying more weight than Elena could have known. "That's not a quality people often associate with me." He gestured toward the bar stools. "Would you mind sitting for a moment? I'd like to ask you something." Elena glanced toward the kitchen, checking the time on her phone. "My shift ends in 10 minutes. I suppose I can spare a few." They sat in relative privacy, the lunch crowd having mostly dispersed. Marcus found himself struggling with how to begin, not a familiar sensation for someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of executives and investors. "The other night," he finally said, "you mentioned studying linguistic anthropology in Florence. What brought you to New York? To this?" He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. Elena's expression became guarded. "Life rarely follows the path we plan, Mr. Wellington. Sometimes we make choices that lead us far from where we expected to be. That's not really an answer." "No," Eleanor agreed with a slight smile. "It's not, but it's all the answer I'm prepared to give to someone I barely know." Marcus felt a flash of his old impatience, the reflex of a man accustomed to getting information when he demanded it. But something in Elena's steady gaze made him reconsider his approach. "You're right," he said. "I'm not entitled to your story." He paused, then surprised himself by continuing. "I spent 2 years at the Sorbonne, actually. Business and economics, not linguistics. But I remember the way Paris changes you, the way speaking another language makes you see the world differently." Elena's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Your French was quite good the other night, despite your earlier assumptions about language abilities." Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed. "I deserve that. And you're being far more gracious about this than I have any right to expect. What do you want, Mr. Wellington?" "Really?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Marcus realized he wasn't entirely sure himself. "I keep thinking about what happened. Not just the embarrassment, though there was plenty of that, but the way you handled it. You could have humiliated me in front of my guests. You had every right to. Instead, you were kind. Kindness costs nothing," Elena said simply. "Cruelty, on the other hand, can be very expensive for everyone involved." Marcus studied her profile as she spoke, noting the way she chose her words carefully, precisely. "Where did you teach before coming to New York?" Elena was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that hadn't been there before. "Guatemala City University. I had a position in the languages department, specializing in indigenous linguistics. I was working on preserving some of the smaller Mayan dialects before they disappeared entirely." "That sounds important. Meaningful work." It was. Elena's hands, Marcus noticed, were never quite still. Even now she was absently tracing patterns on the bar surface. "I loved my students. They were so eager to learn, to understand how language shapes culture and identity." "What happened?" Elena looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the look of someone who had lost something precious and was still learning how to live without it. "Political instability, budget cuts. The university eliminated several programs, including mine. By the time I realized the position wasn't coming back, I'd already spent my savings trying to stay afloat." She shrugged, but the gesture didn't quite mask her pain. "I came here thinking I could find another teaching position, but without connections, without perfect documentation, it's difficult." Marcus felt an unexpected surge of anger on her behalf. "So you're washing dishes while you figure out your next move?" "I'm washing dishes because dishes need to be washed, and it's honest work that pays my bills," Elena corrected firmly. "There's no shame in it." The rebuke was gentle but clear. and Marcus found himself reassessing his assumptions once again. "You're right. I didn't mean to imply otherwise." Elena nodded, accepting the apology. "My shift is ending. Was there anything else you needed to say?" Marcus realized he didn't want the conversation to end, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "Would you have dinner with me?" "Not here," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Somewhere quieter. I'd like to hear more about your work with indigenous languages." Elena studied him with those intelligent brown eyes. Why? It was a fair question, and Marcus found himself without a ready answer. "Because I think I've spent too many years surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. You don't seem interested in doing that." "No," Elena agreed. "I'm not." "So? Dinner?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her decision. "There's a small cafe in Queens near where I live, authentic Guatemalan food. If you're genuinely interested in learning something, rather than just assuaging your guilt, you're welcome to join me there tomorrow evening." She pulled a napkin toward her and wrote down an address in precise handwriting. 7 o'clock. "And Mr. Wellington, come as yourself, not as the person you think I expect you to be." With that, Elena stood and walked back toward the kitchen to collect her things, leaving Marcus sitting at the bar with the napkin in his hand and the distinct feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to become significantly more complicated. As he left Sterling's and walked back toward his tower of glass and steel, Marcus found himself thinking not about quarterly reports or expansion plans, but about indigenous languages disappearing into silence and the woman who had crossed an ocean to try to preserve them. For the first time in years, Marcus Wellington was curious about someone other than himself, and he had absolutely no idea what that might mean. Marcus Wellington stood outside Corazon de Guatemala in Queens, feeling more nervous than he had before any billion-dollar business negotiation. The small cafe occupied the ground floor of a modest brick building, its windows glowing warmly in the early evening light. Hand-painted murals depicting Guatemalan landscapes decorated the exterior walls, and the scent of cumin and cilantro drifted from the open door. He checked his watch, 6:58 p.m. For once in his life, Marcus had deliberately arrived early, spending 20 minutes walking around the neighborhood to calm his nerves. The tree-lined streets of this part of Queens were worlds away from his Manhattan penthouse, filled with families pushing strollers, elderly couples sitting on stoops, and the sounds of multiple languages mixing in the warm September air. Elena emerged from the cafe's entrance just as the church bells from a nearby cathedral chimed 7 o'clock. She wore a simple green dress that complemented her complexion, and her hair fell loose around her shoulders. Marcus was struck again by how different she looked away from the harsh lighting and steam of Sterling's kitchen. "Mr. Wellington," she greeted him with a slight smile. "I wasn't entirely sure you'd come." "Marcus, please, and I said I would." "You did, but wealthy men often make promises they have no intention of keeping." There was no malice in her words, just a matter-of-fact observation that made Marcus wince slightly. "Fair enough. I suppose I haven't given you much reason to trust my word." Elena studied his face for a moment, then nodded toward the cafe. "Come on." Rosa has been cooking all afternoon. She's the owner, and refuses to believe anyone could survive on the portions served at fancy Manhattan restaurants, as she puts it. The interior of Corazon de Guatemala was small and intimate, with maybe a dozen tables covered in brightly colored tablecloths. The walls were decorated with traditional Guatemalan textiles and photographs of what Marcus assumed were family members. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and a warm smile emerged from behind the counter, immediately enveloping Elena in a maternal hug. "Mija, you brought your friend," Rosa exclaimed in accented English, then switched seamlessly to rapid Spanish that Marcus could only partially follow. Elena responded in the same language, and he caught enough to understand they were discussing him with the fond exasperation of women who had dealt with difficult men before. "Rosa, this is Marcus. Marcus, this is Rosa Morales. She and her husband Miguel own this place." "Welcome, welcome." Rosa clasped Marcus's hand in both of hers. "Elena tells me you appreciate good wine. I have something special for you to try." As Rosa bustled away to prepare their meal, Elena led Marcus to a corner table near one of the murals. This one depicted a bustling market scene with vendors selling colorful textiles and fresh produce. "That's Chichicastenango Market," Elena explained, noticing his interest. "One of the largest indigenous markets in Guatemala. Rosa painted it from memory. She grew up in a village nearby. It's beautiful, very detailed." Marcus settled into his chair, acutely aware that he was probably the only person in a $1,000 suit within several city blocks. "How did you find this place?" Rosa found me, actually. I was having a difficult first week in New York. Culture shock, loneliness, the usual immigrant struggles. I heard Spanish being spoken on the subway and followed the conversation here. Elena's expression softened with the memory. Rosa took one look at me and declared I was too skinny. She's been trying to remedy that situation ever since. Rosa appeared with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine that Marcus didn't recognize. "This is from Guatemala," she announced proudly. "Small vineyard in the highlands, not like your French wines, but made with love." Marcus accepted the glass and took a careful sip. The wine was lighter than his usual preferences, with notes of tropical fruit and volcanic earth. "It's excellent. I've never had Guatemalan wine before." "Most people haven't," Elena said. "The industry is small, still developing, but the terroir is unique. Volcanic soil, high altitude, perfect climate conditions. You sound like you know wine." Elena smiled. "I know many things, Marcus. The question is whether you're genuinely interested in learning about them, or whether this is just an elaborate apology dinner." Marcus set down his wine glass. "Honestly, I'm not sure myself. I've been thinking about our conversation at Sterling's for days. Not just feeling guilty, though there's plenty of that, but genuinely curious. When was the last time someone challenged me to think differently about something? And when was the last time you allowed yourself to be challenged?" The question hung between them as Rosa arrived with their dinner, pepian, a rich stew with chicken and vegetables, in a complex sauce that filled the air with the aromas of toasted sesame and spices Marcus couldn't identify. "Rosa refuses to give me the recipe," Eleanor said, breaking the momentary tension. "She says some traditions should be preserved through practice, not writing." Marcus took a bite, surprised by the depth of flavor. "It's incredible, complex without being overwhelming." Pepian is considered Guatemala's national dish. The recipe has roots in pre-Columbian cooking, but it evolved during colonial times as new ingredients were introduced. It's a perfect example of how language and culture adapt while maintaining their essential identity. "Is that what you were studying? Cultural adaptation through language?" Elena nodded, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "Specifically, I was documenting how indigenous communities maintain their cultural identity through language preservation, even as Spanish and English become dominant. Some of the dialects I worked with are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. That must be heartbreaking work sometimes, knowing that languages are disappearing." "It is, but also hopeful. Every story preserved, every grammar pattern documented, every child who learns their grandmother's language. It's a victory against erasure." Marcus found himself leaning forward, genuinely engaged. "How do you document something like that? I mean, if there are no written records, oral history primarily, hours of interviews with elders, recording stories and songs, mapping grammatical structures." Elena's eyes lit up as she spoke, and Marcus could see the professor she had been. "Language isn't just words, Marcus. It's an entire way of understanding the world. When a language dies, we lose unique ways of thinking, of categorizing experience, of understanding relationships between people and nature. Give me an example." Elena considered for a moment. "In Quiche Maya, there are different words for we, depending on whether you're including or excluding the person you're speaking to. English just has one word, we, but Quiche speakers make a distinction that English speakers don't even consciously think about. So the language shapes how you think about community and inclusion?" "Exactly. And when that language disappears, that particular way of understanding relationships goes with it." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing this information while they ate. Around them, the cafe buzzed with quiet conversation in Spanish and English, families sharing meals, couples holding hands across small tables. "Why did you really come tonight?" Elena asked eventually. Marcus put down his fork, considering the question seriously. "Because I realized I've spent years surrounding myself with people who agree with me. My board members, my investors, even my friends, they all have the same background, the same assumptions, the same blind spots. The other night you showed me one of those blind spots in about 30 seconds. And that bothered you?" "It terrified me," Marcus admitted. "If I could be so completely wrong about something so basic, about you, what else am I missing? How many opportunities have I overlooked because I made assumptions about people?" Elena studied his face. "That's a dangerous realization for someone in your position." "Why dangerous?" "Because once you start questioning your assumptions about people, it's hard to stop, and your entire world is built on those assumptions." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. She was right, of course. His business empire, his social circle, His entire identity was constructed around certain beliefs about merit, worth, and value. If those beliefs were flawed, "Is that what happened to you?" he asked. "In Guatemala, did questioning assumptions cost you your position?" Elena's expression grew distant. "In part, I was researching the economic value of indigenous languages, trying to prove that preserving these cultures could be profitable through ecotourism, traditional crafts, unique agricultural knowledge. But some people preferred the old narratives about progress requiring assimilation. So you lost your funding." "I lost more than that. I lost colleagues who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. I lost a fiancé who decided my work was too political and might hurt his law career. I lost a sense of belonging in my own country." Marcus felt a surge of anger on her behalf, followed immediately by the uncomfortable recognition that he might have been one of those people who preferred comfortable lies. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was. But it also freed me to see things clearly. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters." They sat in comfortable silence as Rosa cleared their plates and brought them café con leche and small pastries shaped like flowers. "These are from my grandmother's recipe," Eleanor explained, breaking off a piece of the delicate pastry. "She taught me to make them when I was 7, said they were made with prayers as much as flour." Marcus bit into the pastry, surprised by the subtle flavors of orange blossom and cinnamon. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She spoke 4 languages fluently, but never learned to read in any of them. All her knowledge was carried in her memory, passed down through stories and songs. Elena's voice grew soft with remembrance. She used to say that the most important things couldn't be written down anyway. They had to be lived. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. The conversation had challenged him in ways he hadn't experienced in years, forcing him to confront assumptions he hadn't even realized he held. "Elena," he said as they prepared to leave, "would you consider having lunch with me next week? Not to apologize this time, but because I'd like to hear more about your work, and because I think you might have insights that could be valuable, genuinely valuable." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Valuable how? I'm not sure yet, but I have a feeling that's exactly why I need to find out." Elena smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Marcus had seen from her. "All right, Marcus, but next time you choose the restaurant. So I'm curious to see what kind of food you think represents who you really are." As they parted ways on the Queen Street corner, Marcus realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to being surprised by his own answer. 2 weeks later, Marcus Wellington stood in the conference room of his Manhattan office, facing a dozen skeptical board members. The polished mahogany table reflected the afternoon sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the familiar scent of expensive leather and fresh coffee filled the air. But today, everything felt different. "Let me understand this correctly, Marcus," said Robert Chen, the longest-serving board member, adjusting his glasses with the careful precision of someone choosing his words diplomatically. "You want to invest $15 million in language preservation programs?" "Cultural linguistics initiatives," Marcus corrected, clicking to the next slide of his presentation. "Specifically, supporting indigenous communities in documenting and preserving endangered languages while developing sustainable economic opportunities around their cultural heritage." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could see the barely concealed concern on his board members' faces, the look of people wondering if their CEO had suffered some kind of breakdown. "Marcus," said Patricia Yamamoto, leaning forward with the careful tone one might use with an unstable relative, "this is quite a departure from our usual tech investments. What's the expected ROI on something like this?" Marcus had anticipated this question, but 3 weeks ago he would have answered it very differently. "The return isn't just monetary, Patricia. We are talking about preserving irreplaceable human knowledge, supporting communities that have been marginalized, and potentially discovering sustainable practices and innovations that could benefit everyone." "That sounds very noble," said James Morrison, barely concealing his skepticism. "But our shareholders expect profits, not charity projects. How exactly do you plan to generate revenue from, what was it, indigenous storytelling?" Marcus felt a familiar flash of irritation, but it was directed at himself rather than his board members. He recognized their tone because it was the same dismissive attitude he'd carried for years, the assumption that anything without immediate, quantifiable value wasn't worth pursuing. "James, 3 months ago I would have asked the same question," Marcus replied calmly, "but I've learned something important recently about the difference between price and value, Some of our most successful investments started as ideas that seemed unmarketable. Remember when everyone said social media was just a fad? That's different, Robert protested. Social media had obvious commercial applications. You're talking about preserving languages that most people will never speak. Am I? Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed business plan he'd spent 2 weeks developing with Elena's input. Or am I talking about cultural tourism that could generate millions in revenue for underserved communities? About traditional ecological knowledge that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture? About linguistic diversity that could improve AI language processing? The room grew quieter as the board members studied the projections and case studies Marcus had compiled. He'd done his homework, but more importantly, he'd learned to see opportunities where he'd once seen only obstacles. "How you've clearly put a lot of thought into this," Patricia said finally. "But what sparked this interest? This is completely outside your usual investment philosophy." Marcus paused, knowing this was the moment that would either convince them or confirm their suspicions about his mental state. "I met someone who challenged me to question my assumptions about value and worth. She showed me that some of the most important knowledge in the world is carried by people who would never set foot in a boardroom, speak languages that don't appear in Google Translate, and possess insights that can't be measured by traditional metrics." "She?" James raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, former professor of linguistic anthropology at Guatemala City University. She's agreed to consult on the project and help identify communities and initiatives worth supporting." The title wasn't technically accurate. Elena had lost her position before completing her doctorate, but Marcus had learned enough about her work to know she deserved the recognition. After another hour of questions and detailed financial projections, the board reluctantly approved a pilot program. It wasn't the full 15 million Marcus had requested, but it was enough to begin. As the members filed out, Robert lingered behind. "Marcus, I have to ask, is this really about cultural preservation, or is this about impressing a woman?" Marcus considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, I would have said it was about the woman. Today, I think it's about becoming the kind of person who deserves her respect. That evening, Marcus found himself back at Sterling's, but this time he headed straight for the kitchen. The dinner rush was in full swing, and the controlled chaos he'd observed from afar now surrounded him completely. Steam rose from industrial dishwashers, servers rushed past with loaded trays, and Chef Harrison's voice carried over the clatter of pans and plates. "Elena!" Marcus called out, raising his voice above the noise. She looked up from the glass station, surprise flickering across her face. "Marcus, what are you doing back here?" "I have news. Good news, I think." He held up a folder containing the board's approval documents. "Also, I wanted to ask you something important." Elena dried her hands on her apron, glancing around at her curious co-workers. "Can it wait until my shift ends? This isn't exactly the place for a private conversation." "Actually, that's part of what I wanted to ask you about." Miguel appeared at Elena's shoulder, his expression protective. "Everything all right, Elena?" "It's fine, Miguel. This is Marcus Wellington, the man from Table 12 I told you about." Miguel's expression shifted to one of wary respect. "Ah, the wine guy. You taught him some manners, I heard." Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed. "She did indeed, which is why I'm here." He turned back to Elena. "I got approval for the cultural linguistics project we discussed, but I realized I need someone to head the initiative, someone who understands both the academic and practical aspects of language preservation." Elena's eyes widened. "Marcus, what are you saying? I'm offering you a position with Wellington Ventures, Director of Cultural Initiatives. You'd have full autonomy to develop programs, choose communities to support, and build partnerships with academic institutions. The salary would be..." He named a figure that made Elena's eyes widen further. The kitchen had grown quieter, with several staff members pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word. "You want to hire me?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise. "I want to give you the resources to continue the work you started in Guatemala, but on an international scale. You'd be able to support communities worldwide, document endangered languages, and develop sustainable economic opportunities around cultural preservation." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus suddenly worried he'd misunderstood her interest, her passion for the work. "This isn't charity," he added quickly. "This is recognizing expertise where I find it, regardless of where that person happens to be working at the moment." Elena looked around the kitchen, at Miguel's encouraging nod, at Sarah, who was grinning broadly from the service window. "I need to think about it." "Of course, Take all the time you need. Marcus handed her the folder. The details are all in there, including the preliminary budget and program outline. We developed it based on our conversations, but obviously you'd have complete freedom to modify the approach. As Marcus prepared to leave, Elena called out to him, "Marcus, why are you doing this? Really?" He paused at the kitchen door, considering his answer carefully. 3 weeks ago, I thought success meant surrounding myself with people who agreed with me and told me what I wanted to hear. You showed me that real success might mean surrounding myself with people who challenge me to be better than I thought possible. And you think I can do that? Marcus smiled. Eleanor, in 30 minutes of conversation, you taught me more about value and worth than I'd learned in 20 years of business school and board meetings. I'm hoping that was just the beginning. 1 month later, Marcus sat in the back row of a small lecture hall at Columbia University, listening to Dr. Elena Vasquez deliver her first guest lecture on economic applications of cultural linguistics. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and business leaders who had heard about Wellington Ventures' groundbreaking new initiative. Elena commanded the stage with the natural confidence of someone who had found her calling. She spoke about language as economic asset, about indigenous knowledge systems that could revolutionize sustainable practices, about the untapped potential residing in communities that mainstream business had consistently overlooked. In the audience, Marcus recognized several board members who had initially questioned the investment. Patricia Yamamoto was taking careful notes, and even skeptical James Morrison seemed genuinely engaged. After the lecture, as the crowd dispersed, Elena made her way over to Marcus. "How did I do?" she asked, though her confident smile suggested she already knew. "You were brilliant. Though I have to admit, watching you up there, I realized something." "What's that?" Marcus grinned. "I never should have been surprised by your expertise. The real surprise is that it took me so long to recognize it." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, you learned eventually, that's what matters." As they walked together across the Columbia campus, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his world had changed. The cultural linguistics program was already generating interest from universities worldwide. Tourism boards were inquiring about partnerships, and 3 major tech companies wanted to collaborate on AI applications. But more importantly, Marcus had learned to see opportunity where he'd once seen only obstacles, to recognize expertise wherever he found it, and to understand that true value couldn't always be measured in quarterly reports. "Elena," he said, as they reached the street corner where their paths diverged, "thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me that the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers." Eleanor smiled, adjusting the strap of her new leather briefcase, a far cry from the rubber gloves and hairnet of just a few weeks earlier. "You know, my grandmother used to say that wisdom could be found anywhere, but only by people humble enough to look for it." As Marcus watched Elena disappear into the crowd of students and faculty, he realized that his grandmother's wisdom had been proven once again. Sometimes the most valuable education came not from prestigious institutions or expensive consultants, but from a dishwasher who spoke 5 languages and understood the true worth of human knowledge. The transformation was complete, not just Elena's return to her calling, but Marcus's evolution from someone who judged worth by surface appearances to someone who recognized that the most profound insights often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages.